Hi guys, this is Connie, back for some more Connie Reads White Fragility. We're on chapter 3, which we are breaking down into 3 different sections because they all have subsections. This is section 2, called Aversive Racism. Aversive racism is a manifestation of racism that well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. It exists under the surface of consciousness because it conflicts with consciously held beliefs of racial equity and justice. Aversive racism is a subtle but insidious form, as aversive racists enact racism in ways that allow them to maintain a positive self-image. E.g., I have lots of friends of color. Quote, I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Whites enact racism while managing a positive image in many ways. Rationalizing racial segregation as unfortunate but necessary to access good schools. Rationalizing that our workplaces are virtually all white because people of color just don't apply. Avoiding direct racial language and using racially coded terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, sketchy, and good neighborhoods. Denying that we have few cross-racial relationships by proclaiming how diverse our community or workplace is. Attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism. Consider a conversation I had with a white friend. She was telling me about a white couple she knew who had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. This was the moment of white racial bonding between this couple who shared the story of racial danger and my friend, and then between my friend and me, as she repeated the story. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of black space and drew boundaries between us and them, without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. Notice that the need for a gun is a key part of this story. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis were on the price of the house alone. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap, because it's in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. Yet, while very negative and stereotypical representations of blacks were reinforced in that exchange, not naming race provided plausible deniability. In fact, in preparing to share this incident, I texted my friend and asked her the name of her city her friends had moved to. I also wanted to confirm my assumption that she was talking about a black neighborhood. I share the text exchange here. Hey, what city did you say your friends had bought a house in for $25,000? New Orleans. They said they live in a very bad neighborhood and they each have to have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't pay 5 cents for that neighborhood. I assume it's a black neighborhood? Yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere where I wasn't afraid. I wasn't asking because I want to live there. I'm writing about this in my book, the way that white people talk about race without ever coming out and talking about race. I wouldn't want you to live there. It's too far away from me. Notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhood being so Notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhood being so bad that her friends need guns. When I ask if the neighborhood is black, she is comfortable confirming that it is. But when I tell her that I am interested in how whites talk about race without talking about race, she switches the narrative. Now her concern is not Now her concern is about not wanting me to live so far away. This is a classic example of aversive racism, holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse, but not being able to admit it because the disdain conflicts with our self-image and professed beliefs. Readers may be asking themselves, but if the neighborhood is really dangerous, why is acknowledging this danger a sign of racism? Research in implicit bias has shown that perceptions of criminal activity are influenced by race. White people will perceive danger simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. But regardless of whether the neighborhood is actually more or less dangerous than other neighborhoods, what is salient about this exchange is how it functions racially and what it means for the white people engaged in it. For my friend and me, this conversation did not increase our awareness of the danger of some specific neighborhood. Rather, the exchange reinforced our fundamental beliefs about black people. Toni Morrison uses the term race talk to capture, quote, the explicit insertion into everyday life of racial signs and symbols that have no meaning other than positioning African Americans into the lowest level of the racial hierarchy. Casual race talk is a key component of white racial framing because it accomplishes the interconnected goals of elevating whites while demeaning people of color. Race talk always implies a racial us and them. Consider an experience I had with aversive racism. My last academic position was in a state I had never been to before my interview. Throughout the 3 days of interviewing, other white people warned me not to buy a home in Springfield or Holyoke if I took the position, especially if I had children. While no one openly named race, the racial coding was not lost on me. I now knew where the people of color were concentrated in the area. At the same time, because no one directly mentioned race, we could all deny that this was what we were actually talking about. Returning to my hotel room the first night, I looked up the demographics. Sure enough, Springfield and Holyoke had significantly high populations, close to 50% of black and brown people. Starting on day one of my visit, my fellow whites had communicated the racial boundaries to me. My teacher education students are also engaged in race talk, reinforcing the boundaries between us and them, while positioning us as superior. They engage in race talk when they expressed fear about being placed in dangerous neighborhoods, while describing their hometowns as sheltered. These depictions are relentlessly strengthened by news stories that position violent crime committed in primarily white suburban communities as shocking, yet claiming that one has grown up in a sheltered environment raises a question that begs to be answered. Sheltered from what, and in contrast to whom? If we grow up in environments with few, if any, people of color, we are not, in fact, less sheltered from racist conditioning because we have to rely on narrow and repetitive media representations, jokes, omissions, and warnings for our understanding of people of color. Conversely, positioning white spaces as sheltered and those who are raised in them as racially innocent taps into classic narratives of people of color as not innocent. Racist images and resultant white fears can be found at all levels of society, and myriad studies demonstrate that whites believe that people of color, and blacks in particular, are dangerous. Whites rarely consider how sheltered and safe their spaces may be from the perspective of people of color, e.g. Trayvon Martin's experience in a gated white community, because it reverses the actual direction of racial danger. This narrative may be one of the most pernicious. That's a new one for me. When you consider the moral judgment we make about people we deem as racist in our society, the need to deny our own racism, even to ourselves, makes sense. We believe we are superior at a deeply internalized level and act on this belief in the practice of our lives, but we must deny this belief to fit into society and maintain our self-identity as good, moral people. Unfortunately, aversive racism only protects racism because we can't challenge our racial filters if we can't consider the possibility that we have them. Of course, some whites explicitly avow racism. We might consider these whites actually more aware of and honest about their biases than those of us who consider ourselves open-minded, yet who have rarely thought critically about the biases we inevitably hold or how we may be expressing them. The next section is going to be cultural racism, and that'll be for the next upload. Be careful with that and enjoy. Please and thank you, and I will see you for the next installment next time. Have a great one.